10-year-old Sophie Carter clutched a small, battered tin box to her chest as she made her way toward the town's auction barn, her heart pounding with determination. Inside the box were all her savings, birthday money, Christmas gifts, and every dollar she had earned from doing chores. It wasn't much, but today, it had to be enough. She wasn't here for just any auction, she was here for something important. Her mother, Lauren, walked beside her, arms crossed tightly, her expression a mix of confusion and concern. "Sophie, I don't understand why you insisted on coming here." "We don't need a dog," Lauren said, her voice edged with frustration. But Sophie didn't respond. She had long learned that explaining things to adults never really worked the way she wanted. Instead, she tightened her grip on the tin box and kept walking. Inside the barn, the air was thick with the scent of hay and sawdust, mingling with the faint aroma of livestock. Rows of metal pens lined the walls, filled with animals waiting to be sold: goats, horses, pigs, and, of course, dogs. Some of the dogs barked excitedly, tails wagging, eager for attention. Others curled up in the corners of their enclosures, resigned to whatever fate awaited them. Then Sophie saw him. A German shepherd lay motionless in the farthest pen, his ribs visible through his dull, unkempt coat. Unlike the other dogs, he didn't wag his tail or perk his ears up. His amber eyes held no excitement, only a weary acceptance of whatever was coming next. Sophie's heart clenched. "That one's been returned twice," a deep voice interrupted her thoughts. She turned to see the auctioneer, a middle-aged man with a weathered face and a voice like gravel, standing beside her. Named Shadow. Was supposed to be a service dog, but he didn't make the cut. Turns out he's got health issues, seizures. No one wants a broken dog, kid. "I do," Sophie said immediately, without hesitation. Lauren stiffened beside her. "Sophie." The auctioneer scratched his chin, looking at the small girl before him. "Kid, I admire your spirit, but this ain't a pet adoption fair. That dog needs medical care, probably training. He's more trouble than he's worth." But Sophie wasn't listening. She had already made up her mind. The auction was in full swing, the sharp crack of the gavel echoing through the dusty barn with each sale. Sophie stood near the front, her small hands clenched tightly around the tin box, her fingers trembling against the cool metal. Her heart pounded so hard she could feel it in her throat. The steady hum of voices around her blurred into a distant murmur as she kept her eyes fixed on the pen where Shadow lay. The German shepherd barely moved, his once proud body slumped against the wooden slats. His dull, lifeless eyes stared blankly ahead, as if he had already given up. Sophie swallowed hard. She couldn't let that happen. She wouldn't. The auctioneer's voice rang out again, loud and commanding. "Lot 47, German Shepherd, male. Former service dog trainee. Requires medical attention. Who'll start the bidding at $50. A hush fell over the crowd. Sophie's breath hitched. She scanned the faces around her, silently pleading for someone, anyone, to show interest, but no hands went up. The moment stretched painfully long, and her stomach twisted with nerves. "All right then," the auctioneer tried again. $40? Again, silence. A few people shifted uncomfortably. Someone in the back muttered something under their breath. A heavy feeling settled in Sophie's chest. No one wanted a sick, broken dog. No one except her. She hesitated only for a second before taking a deep breath and stepping forward. $20, she said, her voice shaking but determined. A ripple of murmurs passed through the crowd. A few people chuckled softly, amused by the sight of a little girl trying to buy a dog at a livestock auction. Sophie ignored them, her fingers tightening around her tin box. Lauren, standing beside her, immediately placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Sweetheart, you don't have to." The auctioneer cut in, his voice laced with faint amusement. "Do I hear 25? Sophie's heart nearly stopped. She held her breath, terrified someone might outbid her. She squeezed the tin box even tighter, willing the auction to move faster. The seconds stretched unbearably long. No one else spoke. No hands went up. The auctioneer let out a sigh. "All right, $20, going once, going twice," he lifted his gavel. Sophie braced herself. "Sold! To the young lady up front." The gavel struck down with finality. A rush of relief crashed over Sophie, so powerful she felt dizzy. She let out a shaky breath, her entire body trembling with a mix of nerves and triumph. She had done it. Shadow was hers. Sophie's hands trembled as she gripped the worn leather leash, leading Shadow away from the chaos of the auction pen. Her heart pounded against her ribs, a relentless, aching rhythm that echoed the whirlwind of emotions inside her. Relief, disbelief, and an overwhelming sense of responsibility all crashed over her at once. She had done it. She had saved him. But as she glanced down at the frail creature beside her, her chest tightened. The hardest part was yet to come. The air around them was thick with dust, stirred up by the restless movement of the crowd and the frantic shifting of livestock. The sounds of shouting bidders, clanking chains, and the occasional distressed whimper of an animal still filled the space behind her, but Sophie barely noticed. It was as if the world had faded into the background, leaving only her, Shadow, and the daunting road ahead. The dog moved hesitantly, each step slow and unsure. His thin legs wobbled beneath him, and every few strides, he stumbled, his frail body barely able to support itself. Sophie felt a pang of sorrow so sharp it nearly stole her breath. His fur, once thick and gleaming, now clung to his skeletal frame in matted clumps. His ribs jutted out, painfully visible beneath his skin, and the dullness in his eyes told her everything. He had long since given up on hope. Tears burned at the edges of her vision, but she blinked them away. She wouldn't cry. Not now. Shadow didn't need her sadness. He needed her strength. Beside her, Lauren walked in silence, her arms crossed over her chest. She stole glances at Sophie, her expression unreadable. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she spoke. "That was incredible," she said, her voice laced with quiet admiration. "Not many people would have done what you did." Sophie exhaled slowly, trying to steady herself. Her grip on the leash tightened as she kept her focus on Shadow. "I couldn't leave him," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I couldn't let them take him. Not after everything he's been through." Lauren nodded, her eyes softening. "I know," she said simply. Shadow let out a weak whimper, his body swaying as if even standing was too much. Sophie's heart clenched. Without a second thought, she stopped walking and knelt beside him. Every movement was slow, careful, as if she were afraid of scaring him. For a moment, Shadow flinched, his body tensing as though expecting pain. Sophie froze, her breath catching. She reached out again, this time even gentler, barely grazing his brittle fur with her fingertips. His entire body shivered under her touch. She wanted to tell him it was okay. That he was safe now. But the words lodged in her throat, stuck behind the lump of emotions threatening to spill over. Then, just as she was about to pull away, Shadow did something that nearly shattered her heart. He turned his head toward her, ever so slightly, his dull eyes searching hers. And then, with a hesitation so faint she almost missed it, his tail moved. It was barely a wag, just the smallest flicker of motion, but it was there. A choked breath escaped Sophie's lips. The dam inside her nearly broke, but she held on, swallowing the rising sobs. Instead, she cupped his face gently, her thumb stroking his cheek with the kind of tenderness he likely hadn't known in years. "It's okay, buddy," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You're safe now. I promise." Shadow didn't move, but something in his posture softened. He didn't trust her, not yet. But he wanted to. And that was enough. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting its golden light over them, Sophie knew with absolute certainty that no matter how long it took, no matter how difficult the road ahead might be, she would never give up on him. Because in that moment, Shadow wasn't just another lost soul. He was hers. And she was his. Sophie carefully slid her arms under Shadow's frail body, feeling the sharpness of his bones beneath his patchy fur. He barely reacted, his head lolling slightly against her shoulder. Was he too weak to resist, or did he already trust her, even in his broken state? A lump formed in her throat as she carried him toward the car, his trembling body radiating warmth against her own. She moved gently, mindful of every step, as if any sudden motion might shatter what little strength he had left. Lauren stood by the open car door, watching in silence. Her heart ached at the sight of the battered dog, his ribs pressing against his thin skin, his dull eyes holding no trace of the life he must have once known. She wanted to say something, anything, to break the heavy quiet that had settled between them, but no words seemed right. So instead, she reached out and helped steady Shadow as Sophie carefully placed him onto the soft blanket in the back seat. The moment Shadow touched the fabric, a faint sigh escaped his lips, his body relaxing just slightly. It wasn't comfort, not yet, but it was something. Sophie lingered for a moment, her fingers lightly brushing against his fur, as if trying to reassure him without words. She wanted him to understand that he was safe now, that the suffering he had endured was over. She straightened, closing the car door softly, as if afraid a loud noise might startle him. The weight of the moment pressed heavily on her chest. They had done it, they had pulled him from that horrible place, from the cruel hands of those who saw him as nothing more than an object to be discarded. But now, an even greater challenge lay ahead. Would he heal? Would he ever trust again? Or had the world already taken too much from him? As she climbed into the driver's seat, she turned to Lauren, her voice quieter than before. Are you ready? Lauren met her gaze, her eyes glistening in the dim light. Then, with a small but resolute nod, she answered, yeah. Let's take him home. The engine rumbled softly as Sophie started the car, the low hum filling the silence. As they pulled away from the auction lot, leaving behind the cruelty and despair, she glanced at the rearview mirror. Shadow was curled up on the blanket, his breathing slow, his body finally at rest. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for sure, she wouldn't give up on him. No matter how long it took, no matter how hard it would be, she would be there. Every step of the way. The car ride home was heavy with silence, a quiet that seemed almost fragile, as if any sudden movement or noise might shatter the delicate moment. The only sounds were the soft hum of the engine and the occasional rustle of the blanket where Shadow lay curled up in the back seat. Sophie's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles had turned pale. She kept stealing glances in the rearview mirror, her breath catching each time she looked at the frail body stretched out behind her. Was he breathing? Was he okay? Her heart clenched in fear until she saw the faint, rhythmic rise and fall of his chest. A wave of relief would wash over her, only to be replaced moments later by a deep, gnawing worry. He was safe now, but for how long? Had they really saved him, or had they only delayed the inevitable? Beside her, Lauren sat motionless, her gaze fixed on the window, though she wasn't really looking at anything outside. Her mind was still trapped in the horrors of the auction house, replaying the scene again and again in painful detail. The harsh lights, the stench of neglect, the lifeless resignation in Shadow's eyes as he had been dragged onto that platform like an object, not a living soul. The way the auctioneer had carelessly rattled off his worth, as if he were nothing more than a disposable thing. And the bidders, those cold, expressionless faces that had barely spared him a glance before moving on, uninterested in something so weak, so broken. The memory made her stomach twist with fury and sorrow in equal measure. She clenched her fists in her lap, nails digging into her skin. How many others had never made it out? How many had been left behind, abandoned to a fate far worse than this? A faint, almost inaudible whimper from the back seat broke through the oppressive silence. Instantly, Lauren turned, her heart pounding, afraid of what she might see. Shadow had shifted slightly, his body tensing as if caught in a bad dream. Without thinking, she reached back, her fingers trembling as they brushed gently against his patchy fur. It's okay, she whispered, barely able to find her voice. You're safe now. No one's going to hurt you. At the sound of her voice, Shadow flinched, just a small, involuntary movement, but enough to make her chest tighten painfully. He didn't trust them yet. He didn't know that the nightmare was over. Sophie let out a quiet sigh, keeping her eyes on the road but feeling the weight of Lauren's emotions as if they were her own. He's going to need time, she said, her voice steady but low, as if speaking too loudly might unsettle him further. A lot of time. But we'll help him. However long it takes. Lauren nodded, though she wasn't sure if Sophie could see it. Her fingers remained resting lightly against Shadow's side, barely touching, not wanting to startle him but needing him to feel that he wasn't alone. The road stretched ahead of them, endless and uncertain, just like the journey they had begun with Shadow. It wouldn't be easy. There would be setbacks, bad days, moments when it felt hopeless. But tonight, he was with them. That was what mattered. As the city lights flickered in the distance, casting a soft glow over the dark streets, Shadow let out a deeper sigh, his body relaxing, just the slightest bit, against the warmth of the blanket beneath him. It was small, barely noticeable, but to Sophie and Lauren, it was everything. Because it meant that, maybe, just maybe, he was starting to believe that he was finally safe.